I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar, Food Producers Shall Not Go Hungry, Broken Globalized Food Systems and COVID-19. This is a webinar series organized by the Food Sovereignty and Resource Justice Cluster of the Asia-Europe People's Forum, AEPF. For those of you who do not know AEPF, AEPF is an interregional network of progressive CSOs from across Asia and Europe. My name is Yifang from FIA International, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session today, together with Farooq Tariq, who's the General Secretary of the Pakistan Kissan Rabita Committee, a network of peasants organizations in Pakistan. In this webinar series, we want to build on the stories and analysis of food producers, exploring the way that the present crisis has revealed and deepened problems in the globalized international food system. We hope we can illuminate the interconnectedness of the current food crisis with producers as well as consumers, and discuss the underlying problems of the globalized food systems. Now, quickly on the format of the webinar. The webinar has 3 sessions. In the first session, our panelists will be speaking for about 8 minutes. Then we have a round of Q&A session, followed by a concluding session. Now, just a little housekeeping before we get started. You'll be muted during the webinar. And as I have already said, and you probably read it already in the chat boxes, this webinar will be translated into Bahasa. You'll have to choose the Russian language, and Urdu, you have to choose Chinese. So please select the channel you want. You can share your questions during the webinar using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen or in the comments section below. The chat box can be used for general comments, but please do not use the chat box for sending your questions to the panelists, because otherwise it gets a bit difficult to keep track of them. Now I have the pleasure to introduce you, our panelists today. We have 4 speakers. We have Hashim bin Rashid, a member of the Pakistan Kissan Rabita Committee, who's also a researcher and a PhD candidate at SOAS University of London. Welcome, Hashim. We then have Ashlesha Kurniawaty, National Program Coordinator of Solidaritas, Perempuan, a national women's rights organization in Indonesia. Welcome, Arie. Then we have Felix Anderl from the University of Cambridge. He also represents Asienhaus in Germany and is a member of the International Organizing Committee of AEPF. Welcome, Felix. Then we have Ashlesha Khadse. Ashlesha wears many hats. She has been a volunteer and ally of Indian farmers movement since 2009. She's an independent researcher and a member of the Amrita Bhumi Agroecology School, which is Campesina's agroecology school in South Asia. She also works in an organization called Thousand Currents. Before I give the floor to the panelists, 2 final points. Number 1, this webinar will be recorded, can also be viewed later on the Facebook page of the AEPF. And 2, if you're on Twitter or on other social media, we're using the hashtags AEPF. Your thoughts and reflections on this webinar. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you and welcome our first speaker, Hashim. Hashim will take us through and talk about the neoliberal transformation of Pakistan's food system and how this makes the COVID situation worse for peasants and the working poor. It will be great for all speakers if you can speak slowly so we can have good translations into Urdu and Bahasa. Hashim, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. I think it's important to maybe start by noting the irony of the topic we have chosen, which is food producers must not go hungry. I mean, one would assume that food producers do not go hungry, simply because of the fact that they are the ones that produce food. But the reality is that across the world, in the globalized neoliberal food system we have, food producers are the ones that often face the most acute hunger. part of the reason is the fact that food producers have been forced to produce increasingly for the market and have very little left for their own consumption. What I will try to do first is to try and explain or give a snapshot of this history in Pakistan. And I will, well, I mean, for brevity, start in the neoliberal period. Uh, Starting in the 1980s, there is an attack on Pakistan's food system under a military dictatorship. I mean, often we sort of criticize the Zia dictatorship for Islamization, but very few look at the economic agenda of this government. With the support of the World Bank and the IMF, the Zia government undertakes a number of measures. Uh, First, it starts by reversing land reform, uh, which had been a demand of the peasant movements from the 1950s onwards. Then it undertakes sort of an attack on two parts of the food system. The first, which is public procurement, where the state procures produce from farmers at guaranteed prices, and two, the public distribution system, which was designed to ensure that cheap food could be available to the mass population. One of the major sort of two major changes that take place is that within 10 years, the amount of subsidies given to agriculture reduced by 1/10. So between 2000, sort of 1978 and 1988, such a major change takes place. The other major area which is disinvested in is seed research. Before that, the state undertakes seed research as well as distribution, but this is then transferred quite quickly to private seed companies, including transnational ones. This results in a situation where small peasant farmers have had to rely on market mechanisms and highly volatile commercial produce to be able to make ends meet. This has led to a situation in which agriculture has increased in its proportion in trade, including indirectly through export industries such as textile. Uh, this, in effect, of course, means that when the COVID situation has hit and international textile demand has fallen down, uh, cotton producers are going to suffer massively going into the future. There's also been an increase in the agribusiness entry in agrarian markets, which includes the multinational domination of milk markets, as well as agricultural input markets, including fertilizers, seeds, and pesticides. This has increased, of course, the cost of production for farmers and the volatility of prices for them. Uh, but on the one side, while farmers continue to be paid less for their produce, and the price of production actually continues to increase, consumers continue to pay more for food. So the profits from agricultural production continue to go elsewhere into capitalist circuits, which are both national and transnational. This, in effect, has continued a long trend of mass dispossession, where millions have been displaced from the rural countryside since the Green Revolution onwards, and these dynamics are very similar across South Asia. We've also seen the increase in ecological distress in land, water, soils, and crops. And this situation sort of underpins the COVID disruption of agricultural markets, where the closing of transport and international trade creates a situation in which many small farmers have had to let their produce rot. Uh, in this particular situation, in the context of Pakistan's support to both citizens and small scale farmers and peasants has been limited, we're already seeing a situation of mass unemployment, with textile sector workers across Pakistan already on the streets. As in the current situation, we've also seen the state not move towards a progressive agenda. In the budget that has been announced, has been nothing for the food system. If anything, the state continues to use COVID to push the neoliberal agenda. Uh, only a month ago, the Pakistani state signed an agreement with the World Bank to deregulate the wheat market more, which is astonishing in a context where there was an inquiry into wheat price manipulation in January, which found key government officials to be beneficiaries. The reality is that in Pakistan, national agribusiness lobbies and agrarian capitalists control agrarian policy, and they continue to push for an increase in productivity in export oriented agriculture when both have failed, where crops in excess production have been left in fields to rot, and where crops, and which is partly a result of the fact that agriculture trade markets have collapsed. So this is where I'll sort of leave, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Sorry, I might have been muted. Sorry, my apologies. Now I would like to welcome Arie to share with us social solidarity among the people in response to COVID-19 in Indonesia. The floor is yours, Arie.
Thank you, Yifang. So my name is Arie from Indonesia. My organization is Solidaritas Perempuan. So we are documenting some of facts that we collect from the grassroots women regarding to the COVID-19 situation. But before talking about the crisis, COVID-19, so I would like to mention that actually Indonesia, this country is already dealing with the crisis. Because even Indonesia as an agrarian and also archipelago country with the very huge natural resources as source of food producing, but in fact the number of hunger and malnutrition is still very high. We also found a case that we also found some cases of malnutrition in the area of food producing. So it is absolutely inseparable with the global food system, hijacked by the corporate power and also neoliberal system. So COVID-19 was initially denied by our government, so that the handling is very late, and until now, our government still has not been able to overcome. Even recently, Indonesia predicted as the world's next coronavirus hotspot as it continues to record breaking new daily infections. SP has been documenting situation on the ground, and here are some of our notes regarding the response to COVID. So when the first cases COVID-19 in Indonesia were found, it coincides with the harvest season in most parts of Indonesia. But some food harvested by the farmers was not absorbed. Unable to find buyers, small farmers have been dumping their harvest. A similar situation also happened in the context of fisheries. It was a harvesting season, and although fisher folks can still going to catch the fish action place was empty due to the large-scale social restriction. And some of them even guarded by the military forces. At the other hand, physical distancing policies also being put in place under this health crisis also lead to rapid online shift, particularly in urban areas like Jakarta, where people turn to several e-retailer dominated the food distribution. So it comes again, profit for the corporations. And our government tends to really ignore the safety and health of residents and prioritizing the economy because it is not applied the lockdown but only the large-scale social restriction, because the government tends to avoid the responsibility of fulfillment for people's food needs to its citizens as mandated in the regulation. And currently we are in the transition into the new normal, when there have been no signs of improvement. And for the civil society organizations, particularly the social movement, think that actually our government really use this crisis to foster and expand their agenda that opposed by the people, namely omnibus law for job creation, mining law, and even some of trade negotiations like RCEP. So it is because the government is still very reliant on the growth, economy, and investment perspective. Even though we come to realize how much we rely on farmers, peasants, fisher folks, other food producers, our local market, and shorter food distribution networks to get our food at this time, but there is no really concrete step from the government to secure our food. And even on the ground, SP still found that our small food producers keep challenged by the infrastructure development, infrastructure project. For instance, in South Sulawesi on the Makassar New Project, land reclamation in Jakarta, Southeast Sulawesi, and other things. So on the other hand, our presidents also to anticipate the food crisis due to COVID-19 to perform creating new paddy fields, and it is most likely in wetlands such as swamps and pit. And it is like we will repeat the failure of the same project in the new order, Suharto era, because pit proved not suitable for planting rice, and it already caused about half of the 15,595 family migrants placed on the left. Besides, the local residents also suffered damage to natural resources and the impact of the hydrology of the project. So this is perspective of a broken food system that continues the colonialist system with the large-scale plantation orientation. So moreover, these activities also involve military forces. SP recorded some cases of state-owned companies which caused land grabbing and agrarian conflict for years, for instance, in Sumatra and also in Sulawesi. The other problem for the urban people, social assistance distributed by the government is also problematic, because the amount of money does not meet the needs of families in crisis situations, and even some package in basic staple food still does not meet the minimum standards of proper nutrition. People on the ground also complain because population that are problematic, so many do not get the package. And it is totally different when we talk about the general election, where no one left behind, even for the dead people. Yeah, so few months ago there is a statement from our minister regarding the human rights. So he mentioned that if we are not able to overcome the coronavirus, and then please consider coronavirus as your wife. So if you are not able to control it, then you have to adapt with it. So it is very small example of how the patriarchy is very institutionalized in Indonesia. And in the context of food systems, women have seen in all stage, production, distribution, also to be presented in our table. However, the importance of women's role in Indonesia, and I'm pretty sure almost in every place, are invisible and not taken into account, because it is considered only to help the head of the family. It goes the recognition, and women not taken into account in some programs are also social assistance. The other case that we found it is women in Indonesia mostly going to shopping in the traditional market to fulfill the family needs. They, if in the meantime, the traditional market do not get full support from the government to implement security protocol. So women become more risk exposure because of this. Besides, women also bear the burden to care for the family when there are someone going to sick. Meanwhile, the services of public health in Indonesia in on very limited capacity. So I want to close with a statement. If the government still doing everything like business as usual, then the crisis will still continue. Food producers shall not be hungry, particularly in the agriculture and archaeology country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arie. Unfortunately, your video was turned off during your talk, and I think, I don't know, just for the participants to have a quick look at your face would be nice.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We didn't want to disturb you in your talk. So thanks, Arie, for highlighting specific impact on women and also highlighting how business as usual will not change anything, and it's actually the measures of the government is promoting the broken food systems in Indonesia. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to then welcome Felix, who will then share with us some major characteristics of the current agriculture system with a spotlight in Europe. Felix, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? All right. Yeah, so we now heard two perspectives from contexts in which a lot of production is still delivered by peasants, fisherfolk, and other small-scale food producers. Within the European imaginary of developing countries, these have long been suggestive symbols for what agriculture used to look like in the past, but will have to change in order to feed the growing world population. The idea is that small-scale food production, agroecology, and subsistence farming is nice and ecological, but it is too crisis-prone and inefficient. To feed the masses in the cities, these food systems need to become more efficient and scale up in order to provide food for the masses. Now, this developmentalist story of progress, from subsistent peasantry to large-scale farming, has provided the justification for the globalized food system based on supposedly free trade and industrialized farming that most Europeans and North Americans, but increasingly also Asians, get their food from. This agricultural system is driven by a number of characteristics that I can only sketch briefly here. First of all, it is fueled by market concentration. A few big companies run the show. In the European Union, this is not just a coincidence. In the EU's budget, of which almost 40% go to agriculture, subsidies are allocated according to square meters of farmland. That means the EU directly favors big farms over small peasants. As an effect, a few farming companies have acquired the biggest chunk of land and are rewarded for this with taxpayer money. At the same time, the grocery and food market is dominated by a handful of extremely powerful companies that can dictate the prices to the farmers. That reinforces the fact that farms need to create economies of scale. That is, only by manufacturing huge amounts of one single good can farmers actually make a profit. This situation, in turn, leads to huge parts of land structured by the same varieties of wheat and corn, and therefore we've been seeing biodiversity getting significantly diminished over the last decades. Even more tragically, it has led to absurd levels of factory farming, where animals have entirely become commodities and live in unbearable conditions. In Germany alone, around 763 million animals die in factory farming every year. That's 10 times the number of inhabitants yearly. Essential basic needs of the animals are ignored, and they are forced to live in cages so small that they often have no space to even turn. Because they are so close together, many diseases are spread, which is why increasing amounts of antibiotics are fed, which in turn leads to resistances among the animals. and through their diet also in humans. This is a major threat to our society, and COVID-19 will surely not be the last animal transmitted disease that we suffer from. So my first point of observation is that in this capitalist industrialized agricultural system, we have the effect of a concentration of production. The agricultural industry has concentrated the rights to seeds and land, the variety of plants have been reduced to a few profitable crops, and animals are quite literally concentrated in one place so that the consumers have cheap prices and the profits go to a few oligopolies. The effects are the destruction of the environment, a terrible ignorance towards animal well-being, and massive dangers to the health of humans. So why are we willing to accept all this? This industrialized form of agriculture has been justified to us on the grounds that in contrast to smallholder peasantry, this system is able to guarantee access to affordable food for all at any time, and that it is less dependent on external factors such as the weather, and therefore less crisis prone and more resilient. However, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to observe that the industrialized agriculture in Europe and the US is in fact very volatile. Because of time reasons, I want to focus on two major problems of our industrialized agricultural production that were unveiled during the pandemic. First, in the beginning of the crisis, the promise of access to food could not be kept. Supermarkets were struggling to meet the high demand, and they rationed key products such as vegetables, milk, and pasta, while at the same time, farmers in many places were unable to market their produce and were sometimes forced to destroy a year's harvest of vegetables. While most of their products are usually bought by restaurant chains and delivered just in time, they have not found channels of distributing their supply during the current crisis. At the same time, many people, particularly in the US, had lost their jobs and desperately needed food, which is why food banks had record demand. But the supplies were often rotting in the fields and couldn't be delivered to those who needed them. Second, as you know, Western European states like Germany, the UK, were under strict lockdown and closed their borders. But then big farms protested because without cheap labor from Eastern Europe, they were not able to harvest their produce. The working conditions there are so terrible that almost no Western European is ready to do the job. This led governments to loosen the health rules for seasonal workers in order to fly in tens of thousands of Eastern Europeans for harvesting. Living in mass accommodation, these workers risk their health for a job that Germans do not like to carry out because the wages are still higher than what they could earn back home. Yet at the same time, in Bulgaria, there is a severe shortage in agricultural labor, threatening to undermine the domestic harvesting season and provoking panic among Bulgarian farmers who predict a shortage in supply of vegetables as its effect. The title of this webinar is "Food Producers Shall Not Go Hungry." It may sound a bit sensationalist, but unfortunately during this pandemic, this was the real risk for actually existing food producers in Europe. The system's promise is built on the back of a number of precarious labor migrants, who unsurprisingly were also at the center of a huge COVID-19 outbreak in a big meat factory in Western Germany last week. Forced to live together in tiny rooms, lacking proper access to sanitation, these workers were at the center of a virus hotspot, during which the authorities found circumstances that have correctly been compared to slavery. My second observation is thus that this industrialized form of agriculture has no overarching planning, regulation, or serious forecasting. Even in non-crisis mode, it works only on the back of precarious workers, while the profits go to a few big supermarket chains. In a crisis like a pandemic, it actually does not hold the promise of a resilient access to food because there is no functioning structure or coordination or contingency planning. To summarize my argument, the capitalist industrial agricultural system is on the one hand very macro when it comes to production. Food production is centralized in very few large companies. At the same time, when it comes to distribution and planning, the system is extremely decentralized. That is to say, there is no real planning beyond the just-in-time logistics. I therefore want to say that COVID-19 showed us that this system is deeply dysfunctional. For more biodiversity, better conditions for animals and agricultural workers, Farms should be diversified, small and flexible. Food provision, to become a public good that is functioning for the many, not only a few companies, we need an overarching institution which is able to plan ahead and to think about food systems from a macro point of view. In short, production should be micro and planning macro. Currently, unfortunately, we see the opposite of that.
Thank you very much, Felix. Thanks for bringing in that European perspective and also highlighting how we really need to discuss and think about the resilience of the food systems. Before I invite the last speaker, I just want to make three announcements for those of you who joined. We have translations into Bahasa and Urdu. For Bahasa, you'll need to choose Russian, and for Urdu, you'll choose Japanese. It's a request to Ashlesha and also all the other speakers, please speak a bit slower. The translators are having a bit of a difficult time translating, so that's a request to everybody. And my final request is that we are getting a lot of good questions, but it's very difficult if you type them all in the chat box, so please type them in the FNAQ box. No, FNA box, exactly, yeah? So that's from my side, and I will welcome Ashlesha, who will be talking to us about or sharing with us the broad context of the food systems in India before and after COVID. And she will also highlight different phases of rural distress that emerge as the result of COVID. So now the floor is yours, Ashlesha.
Thanks, Yifang. Hi, everyone. So all the wonderful speakers before me already highlighted some of the key points that also have parallels with the Indian situation. And I think that food system in India, we cannot really separate it from the larger development path that India has taken. And that is essentially 20 years of neoliberal development. And there's a very clear rural bias, right? Sorry, urban bias in our policy, where we are following a model where we are not interested in rural development. We want to industrialize our country. We would like to shift as many people out of agriculture in rural India, and we want to shift as many people into urban area. But the reality is that while we have forcefully shifted people out of rural India, urban India and industries have not really been able to absorb all the people who have been forcefully pushed out. So we have 20 years of neoliberal development, and what that has led to is creating a very vulnerable population. Majority of our poor are in a very fragile condition. And what we have done is remove the safety nets. Remove public infrastructure, right? If you see what happened in COVID, we can see our public health system, how terrible it is, how it has not been able to deal with the crisis, and how we have literally no public health infrastructure, we have no public education, and we don't have a public food system. And so this has really come to the forefront. In the area of agriculture, I think my colleagues already spoke about privatization, massive corporate concentration, and that's pretty much what happened in India as well. We have a situation for the rural producers where there's a cost price squeeze, and what that is that costs have gone up, production costs have gone up, seed costs have gone up, but food prices have remained artificially low. And that is because our government has a very clear bias. Again, it's like they want to keep food prices low for consumers, but the brunt of it is being borne by farmers, and if you look at, the last food crisis, which happened in 2008, there were food riots around the world, and our government is very cognizant of the dangers of food riots. And so food prices are always artificially kept low, and the result is that farmers have to keep paying much more for their input costs, but they are not getting the right prices for their produce. And so in essence, we have a situation where our farmers have been subsidizing the food system, right? Have been subsidizing cheap food in our country. And I don't want to make it sound like our farmers are very rich and they're able to subsidize. It's really the misery of our farmers that's subsidizing the food system. And also the 28 years of neoliberal growth has led to a situation of an extreme debt crisis in India, because again, farmers have to take very high loans, and loans are usually coming from the informal sector. We have a trader class in India from a particular caste. It's called the Baniya caste. There are upper caste money lenders, they are loan sharks, and so we have a situation where this is the class that has enriched itself again at the misery of farmers, and the inability to pay back loans by farmers has led to a very big crisis of food farmer suicides. And since 1995 in India, we've had about 300,000 farmer suicides, which is something like 30, about every 30 minutes, there's one farmer suicide. So it's quite terrible. And so we have another kind of a civilizational crisis here. And what's happening with consumers, hunger levels are very high. It's a joke, and it's really unfortunate that our leadership likes to project India as some kind of a superpower when we have a country where half our women are anemic. We have the highest malnutrition levels in the world, and this is not a situation of low food production. If anything, India is actually a fairly self-sufficient country, and there are bumper production. We have very big food stocks, but people don't have access to food. And if you look at the work of the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen, he really describes that it's not about supply, it is about inequality, it's about power. And we have created a system where we have disempowered the majority of our people who are not able to access this food. So what happened, given this backdrop, what happened during COVID? Just like in the other countries, we had severe supply chain issues. Markets were closed, and farmers in India were looking forward to a very big harvest in March and April. And just when the harvest season came, COVID hit, and we had a very severe crisis. Of course, rotting foods, no procurement. Farmers were dumping their crops. They were not able to sell. There was also a rumor that chickens caused COVID, so for lots of poultry farmers had to burn their chickens. And the estimates of losses are very high. We have something like 25,000 crore rupees of losses just for vegetable growers. So once again, dairy farmers lost 10,000 crores. So once again, it has been a very massive kind of loss borne by farmers by themselves directly. And yet, despite all this, agriculture has really shown that it is the mainstay of the Indian economy, because despite all these problems, they were able to keep some supplies moving. Farmers are already sowing for the monsoons, and it's still one of the only sectors that is somehow surviving. By any means, it's not without problems. Another issue which really was highlighted during COVID was our casual informal labors. So I don't know if you saw any photos of what was happening in India during COVID, but we have some dramatic photos of migrants from the cities coming back, walking on foot because all transportation was blocked. We had laborers walking 1,000 kilometers, biking 2,000 kilometers. Many people died of starvation while trying to reach homes. And once again, this highlights the agrarian crisis, because these are the same people who were pushed out of farming. In fact, during the 28 years of neoliberalization, India has had one of the greatest migration in human history, and that is just the movement of people from rural to urban areas. And so again, these laborers are coming in, being highlighted, their situation is being highlighted. We have a situation of so much casualization of labor, and they are also the laborers who work in the food system. So finally, the final point I want to make is that despite all these crises, we are seeing lots of positive projects by grassroots actors, and I think these will be highlighted in the next panel, next webinar that is being organized. But the powerful actors are using this time to push through some very unsustainable business as usual approaches that we really have to be careful of. and in India particularly, in the garb of emergency response, some very dangerous amendments and ordinances have been made, particularly in the market sector. And I can talk about this in my closing comments. So I'm just going to stop here and wait for some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Ashlesha, for detailing some of these different layers of challenges that are faced by small-scale food producers in India. But yet, people are, fighting back. And I think, like you said, this will be then the topic of our next webinar. Now, we have excellent questions. And with that, I would like to shift the moderation to my colleague, Farooq, who will then take over. Farooq, please.
Thank you, Yifang. Welcome to all the participants on behalf of Food Sovereignty Cluster of Asia Europe People's Forum. Thank you for your participation. A lot of questions has been raised already, and our panelists are reading some of those questions. And now at this session, the panelists will speak around 4 to 5 minutes. So please take care of your time. And I can ask Hashim bin Rashid to start with. There are questions about Lucas damages in Indian subcontinent and also in Afghanistan and Iran. So, please take that up, and also the corporate food mafia question, and also role of the WTO and so on. So Hashim, if you want to respond some of those questions, please.
Yes, those are big questions, and I think the first thing to remember and perhaps feel good about in what is a dire situation and has been for a while, is that people are asking these questions, and of course, as panelists, we can sort of try and answer those questions, but it is also these answers need to come in through sort of collective thinking and collective action, and more importantly, the action part. And the action part is where I think rural social movements themselves are at the forefront of transforming. One of the organizations that me and Ashlesha, and of course, comrade Farooq, you work with, is La Via Campesina, and this is an international transnational organization that brings together over 130 rural social movements around the world. And this is a movement that is trying to come up with solutions, and it is trying to come up with solutions which have been implemented by our member peasant organizations in different contexts. And again, I don't know if it's a situation where I need to go into particular cases, but it is very much to reiterate sort of what Felix was hinting at, is that food production needs to happen, and distribution needs to happen on a micro scale, whereas planning perhaps needs to happen on a macro scale. But partly we're also sort of talking about, and there have been questions about the ecological crisis, right? And partly, of course, the issue of locusts comes because predators are simply not there, right? We've sprayed so much pesticide that there are no birds to eat the locust anymore. So the only solution we have is to effectively poison all of our countries and sort of sprinkle poison all around without thinking about, again, the fact that it's going to kill more animal and insect life, and it is going to adversely affect the health of humans. And partly what we're talking about with COVID is seeing the fact that at least for the last 30 years, we have seen multiple epidemics and pandemics emerging from the food system. I know someone commented in the chat about sort of avian flu, right? And partly this sort of paranoia around chickens has come around the fact that, I mean, even in the context of Pakistan, also India, during the bird flu spread around between 2005 2007, many poultry farmers had to kill millions of chickens. But we also know that the food supply chain is also one of the heaviest spreader of COVID, right? Uh, Agricultural workers or food supply chain workers within meat processing factories have been deeply and adversely affected. Uh, and so yes, to Atiq's question, yes, we need to reject the corporate food mafia. We need to reject agribusiness, but it can be done by strengthening rural social movements, listening to their demands, working with them, expanding their potential, and of course for rural social movements to also start building solidarity with workers, because we are seeing with sort of the mass unemployment and mass return of workers to villages, that the fact is that the sort of so-called idea that they became urban or proletarian itself is sort of dodgy, right? People still rely on farms and their villages to be able to reproduce themselves. And what needs to be strengthened, and partly, of course, that's why we speak about the need for land reform, where workers need to have land rights. I don't know how much time I have left, but on this question of the WTO, yes, of course, we believe that the WTO has been left superfluous by the situation. But we believe the WTO is superfluous since its founding, right? Of course, we of course, but in terms of what is happening in the international environment, the WTO, especially in terms of the food system, the WTO continues to push for more trade. I mean, one process that I'm a part of in the Committee on World Food Security, we're negotiating guidelines on food systems and nutrition. I mean, we would of course like to call them food systems and hunger. And there, the WTO representative in our last meeting, along with the US and major agribusiness supporting countries, said, well, what do we need right now? What is the cause of this crisis? The fact that trade has collapsed. So what needed to be done amidst the global pandemic, when everyone was stuck at home, people had lost jobs, was to make sure that trade continues. Whereas of course the real debate is about national food sovereignty, about peasant food sovereignty, or food sovereignty for workers, and food producers and agricultural workers, right? And that's what we need to be moving towards. And I'll sort of end there.
Thank you, Hashim. One of the questions raised here by Sarajan Hoda from Malaysia, that what about the solutions? So I'm going to inform all the participants that we are going to hold a second webinar on 10th of July on the issue of alternatives and what to do. So we can raise some issue now, but we will go in details in the second webinar. Now I ask Arie from Indonesia, who has spoken earlier about building of the peasant movements, and also question about compensation to the small farmers. I can just tell you, in Pakistan, the compensation to the small farmers was taken away by the rich people, by the industrialists, by those who make pesticide, and by those who are owners of fertilizers factories. So Arie, please go ahead to respond some of the questions.
Okay. Thank you, Farooq. I will answer about the compensation for the food producers, especially for the fisher. So, because the impact that felt by the fisher is mostly like they don't have anyone to buy their fish that catch from the ocean. So, what government do is to campaign, because So the president only released a statement like statement that people must to consume fish and seafood more often to help the fishers. That's the only things that government do regarding the situation of the pandemic. And I also already answered on the chat on the Q&A. So in Indonesia, there are economic stimulus package in various forms, mostly social package, but as I mentioned before, it not really address the problem, and the data is problematic, and also there is a corrupt situation reported in some areas. And the other question from Kartini from Grain, how about the situation of women farmers before and after the COVID-19 crisis? So what we found out that before the COVID-19 crisis, actually in particularly in SP work areas, they have initiative to build their own agriculture system with more sustain and with more knowledge by that they inherited from generations to generations, like using the local seeds and others. But after the COVID-19, they have trouble to distribute the food harvested by them. We found it in Yogyakarta, also in several areas in Java and also in Sumatra, in South Sumatra. So even though there is a various limitation of the mobilization, like in some part areas they still can go to their paddy fields, but in the other areas they are prohibited to go to their paddy fields. But we collect the situation is like that. So mostly they have a trouble to distribute to sell their food harvested, their paddy harvested. I think, yeah, it is, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Arie. Now I would request Felix about the role of the UN food institutions like FAO and IFAD, as one of the participants raised this question, what role they have played in the broken food chains at present time.
Yes, that's a good question by
Felix.
Martin, I think. Well, I can only say that it's actually quite surprising that we don't have an organization that actually takes care of this. We do have the Food and Agricultural Organization, and with a few colleagues, I have already been thinking about why the FAO is so weak. Actually, if you ask people who work for the FAO, they will bluntly tell you this, that they have no mandate to force any state or other community to behave in a different way. They have no coordinating function, which would be a serious intervention into the market. Compare this with the WTO at its prime, or also the World Bank and other international institutions, which were actually able to restructure entirely some states in the global south, and how they were financing themselves, how they were spending money. So we have a disconnect here between, on the one hand, very, very strong international organizations, although some of them, like the WTO, are actually on the decline. But we don't have an equivalent on a positive vision for internationalized food supply, which is a problem, because food supply is de facto internationalized, and so we don't really have international rules by which farmers, international companies would have to stand by. And I think this is a situation that is currently actually coming to the public consciousness in Europe. And I want to respond to one question by Lakshmi Savitri. Thank you very much for that one. It's on protest in Europe against these conditions. And I can say that one of the biggest demonstrations in the last years in Germany was called Wir haben es satt. Maybe the best translation for that would be "We're sick of it." And it's directly opposed to the food system. However, this demonstration was opposed by the major farmers' unions. Because as I told you in my presentation, the farmers' unions are very much made up of big farms which profit from the agricultural subsidies of the European Union, and smallholder peasants are almost extinct in Western Europe. So there are those, and we do have chapters of La Via Campesina also in the UK and in Germany. But if we're very frank, these are tiny groups, tiny companies, which try to do something, but they lack the power. And so it's a situation in which especially young people increasingly see through the problems of the internationalized and industrialized food system. But the system is so entrenched that it's really hard to do something. And that's why also answering to your second question, Lakshmi, hi, by the way, it is a good idea to have these community-based food systems, but the big problems are on a structural level. And that's why we need to change the structural level. We need to politicize, for example, the common agricultural policy in the EU, and we need to politicize supply chains. And unless we do that, there is very little we can substantially change, which is why I think my opening statement about the Food and Agricultural Organization, the lack of its power, is a major problem.
Thank you. Now I would ask Ashlesha, who is from La Via Compesina from India, that if she could take up the issue of COVID-19, which is spreading like fire in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh at present time. It is on the rise. Now over 500,000 almost people have been formally affected in this Indian subcontinent. So how this COVID-19 is affecting the lives of the farmer, you said earlier, but I want you to say a bit more on that. And also the strategies of our rulers in the Indian subcontinent to deal with COVID-19 is been to go along with the new liberal agenda, business as usual. There is nothing changed according to them. So Ashlesha, if you could comment on that, please.
Thanks, Farooq. You're absolutely right. In fact, rather than going with the business as usual, they are using the opportunity to strengthen business as usual even more. And somebody raised the question of WTO, and WTO for a long time has been demanding that the government remove itself and there's more privatization. And they want India to stop public procurement because they say that it's trade distorting. And India has something called mandis, where we have procurement, where we have, it's a regulated market. So prices are regulated, and the WTO and the World Bank, they really wanted that to be removed. And the COVID has given our government the situation to come in with an ordinance. That means it's not discussed in parliament, it's an executive order. So no public discussion, no parliamentary discussion, and undemocratically they have pushed forth these new laws to privatize the APMCs. And that essentially means that anybody can come and buy, any private players can come and buy, and there's no regulation. So these are very dangerous moves. In the past, some states who tried to do this, you know, private traders, instead of procuring from farmers, started importing from the cheapest wheat from outside, from other countries where it was cheaper. So how is this going to help farmers, even though these moves are made claiming that they're going to help farmers? And somebody asked a question about, I think Artini has asked a question about women farmers. And really it's very important to highlight, because while I'm saying farmers, and somebody, Vincent Manoharan, has spoken about Dalits in India, you know, when we say farmer, we cannot just say farmer. There's so many diverse identities that fall into this. In fact, 70% of our food is produced by by women. You know, they are the labor force pretty much who are working in the fields. Because of the agrarian crisis, there's been a very strong, what we call feminization of agriculture. And that doesn't mean that women are becoming empowered. It's just mean they're doing more of the labor work in farming, but they own none of the land. Even if they are doing it for their own husband, they are not the landowner, and decision making is still not lying with them. And so the situation in a country like India is that less than 10% of land ownership, whether it's joint or individual, is held with women. And women are also responsible. There's many single women in rural India now, many women who are the heads of household, you know, particularly if you look at the more vulnerable women, Dalit women, single women, widowed women, you know, their situation has been even worse, more difficult. Particularly with COVID, what happened is that work completely stopped. Rural laborers were not getting work because of the lockdowns, and that led to a situation where people don't have access to food. And someone else has raised the question about the government policy, 20 lakh crore. Very huge measures were supposedly made, but yes, they have rightly said that these are not necessarily going to reach the most vulnerable, because there are so many you know, problems, impediments. You have to have particular cards, ration cards. Your family members might not be enrolled in that system. You might go, so the government makes claims, but do these actually reach the people is a very important question, particularly the most marginalized. So thanks for raising that point, Vincent. So I think I'll stop here. I'm answering some questions directly on chat as well.
Okay, now we are reaching to the second round of questions, and also we have received several dozens questions in the chat box and also in the Q&A. We would be able to send some of the replies to your emails later, and also take up some of those questions when we come back on 10th of July to take up some issues. Now I will ask Hashim bin Rashid, who has been attending Pakistan Kissan Rabita Committee 2 online meetings in the last 2 weeks, to say something more about the damages which Pakistani small farmers, landless peasantry, agriculture workers, they have suffered in Pakistan, and the response of the government towards them. Hashim bin Rashid. And if you want to say something more than that.
Thank you, comrade. Of course, it's a difficult task to sort of cover the entire picture, and I tried to do a little bit of it in my opening remarks. I think we've sort of continued to hear from many parts of our membership and many of the peasants and small farmers that we work with, how deeply and COVID has impacted their produce. But and there's a range of sectors that we've sort of heard from, ranging from sort of vegetables being left in the fields to sort of flour producers not being able to sell anything, to milk sellers having to sell to, I mean, big multinationals at half the usual price. But I think one of the things to maybe think about too is at a time when many of those who were formerly sort of rural and became urban workers are going back, and there is a sort of surplus population. So usually, I mean, quote unquote, the surplus population tends to exist in cities. Now we arguably have a surplus population in villages. That puts the question of land redistribution itself at the very center, right? But it also, I mean, makes me ask a really simple question, right? Which is, when you have labor in a village and when you have people hungry in your village or in your area, then why would you not let them pick the vegetables or produce, and why would you sort of run a tractor over them, right? And what is lacking in a situation where, yes, we know that small farmers are making a loss, but many others in the same context are going to make a loss because the small farmer is making a loss, right? Especially the labor that is part of the harvesting process. Harvesting labor has suddenly sort of gone down quite massively. Many of our farmers also spoke about how the rates that were being paid to agricultural labor in different sectors were also being reduced. Because the prices have been falling, and in a COVID sort of labor surplus always gives more power to those who have sort of control of sort of, I mean, in Marxist terminology, the means of production, right? And so labor wages across the world have been falling, and I think this is one of the biggest impacts of COVID, which is something that even the last financial crisis of 2008 was unable to do, was reduce wages, right? And what COVID has allowed to happen across the world is a reduction of wages, where anyone who gets work needs to now be thankful that I have work. Uh, and it, but in reality, what that means is people are going to continue to go hungry. I mean, the World Food Program has warned of a famine of biblical proportions. Maybe they're overstating it, but in reality, from the stories we hear on the ground, it is a pretty dire situation. And then to add to that, much of what people have mentioned, the locust swarms that have sort of moved from sort of Eastern Africa to South Asia, the climate crisis that we have with the range of sort of ecological catastrophes. Of course, they put the food supply for the next year at serious risk. And Ashlesha said this before, which is, I mean, Amartya Sen's work on famines effectively gives a simple conclusion. Famines are not a result of underproduction. Famines everywhere have always been a result of a problem in distribution and social inequality. And in a situation where people cannot afford to buy food, this is a food system that is built on wasting food. That is how prices are kept up, right? And in Pakistan's context, since the sort of neoliberal, I mean, we've had neoliberalism for at least 40 years, but since the last 2 years, food prices have actually gone up for consumers by 30%. The same money has not been seen in the rural economy, right? So I'll sort of stop there.
Thank you, Hashim. Now, day before yesterday, over 90 farmers were arrested in Pakistan because they wanted to go to Islamabad to protest against the rising prices of electricity, and also that small farmers have got no compensation by the government. They were released after a day. So the authoritarian nature of the state is on the increase everywhere, all over in Asia. I would like to ask Arie two questions. If she could comment on the authoritarian nature of the regimes in Far East, and also about, I read about 50,000 corona cases now in Indonesia, and the effect of that on the small farmers community and also on the fisher folks. Arie, please.
Yeah, about the authoritarian context in Indonesia is mostly happened in the conflict areas. For instance, in the agrarian conflict in several areas regarding the context of palm oil plantation, and also mostly
Please speak up. Speak up, please. Little louder.
It's not clear.
Okay. No, little louder. You will. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Yes, good.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, there is actually there is a trend in the current government that to be more authoritarian than previous government, because there are some actions by the government to, like, the shrinking space for the CSOs, and also using the military forces in some areas to like to guarding the corporate plantation, for instance, and it happens in some areas in Indonesia. And regarding the increasing cases in Indonesia, so from day to day, like we have almost or more than 1,000 case daily, every day increase. So I'm pretty sure that this is not the actual number, because until now our government is not having a massive test for people in Indonesia. And considering we are also an archipelago country, so it's quite complicated to do so. So there is a positive and also negative thing about it, because if the rural people can lock down themselves, it can be more safe for the people at the rural, because mostly the hotspot in Indonesia in big cities like Jakarta and also Surabaya. So it yeah, I think the situation, it depends, because there is also a problem that there is no good coordination between central government and also the local government, because the local government mostly they are more responsive, they are more having initiative and more concerned to the people, despite of the central government that more tends to be prioritize the economic and investment things. So I just like to add more, because amid the pandemic there is a popular hashtag trending in Twitter for Indonesian: people help people, states help corporate. So people are more alert actually to build collective action and solidarity. There are several initiatives that already exist, such as connecting between rural and urban regarding food supplies. And in some areas, we also rebuild our food barns in the village to anticipate food crisis. And we also having like a circle communication to detect who is the person that just coming from out cities and other things. Yeah, so there are a lot of local wisdom that really emerge in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Arie. Now I would like to ask Felix about the social solidarity, the need to enhance the social solidarity, because one of the main objectives of this webinar is to bring together movements of Asia and Europe closer to each other, to think what to do in this most difficult times, and how we can build more close relationship with each other and build our social solidarity. So Felix from Asienhaus, Germany, can you please speak about the ever-growing need of social solidarity?
Yeah, thank you for posing the easy questions to me. How can we, what is to be done? I wanted to say a few things,
yes.
also going back to a couple of questions on alternatives, because I think the alternatives, we will speak about it
Please.
Next time, but the alternatives and the people's solidarity and resistance are and have to be entangled. Otherwise, it will just be another model project of which we had so many. So there has to be a serious analysis of what's going on, and then a common project. And one of the projects that I think especially Europeans could and should learn from our Asian comrades is to talk about land. Because the issue of land reform has been at the forefront of all agrarian movements in South and Southeast Asia, and rightly so. Speaking about what I talked about before, about the structural solutions, it's always easy to say structure and nobody really knows what it means. Well, structure, and the structure that has to be changed is, I think, twofold. one, who owns the land? We have to redistribute the land, because with huge masses of land being owned by a few companies, we can have all the ecological local solutions we want. The food system will still be governed by these selected companies. So we have to talk about who owns the land. And secondly, production then should, of course, be as local as possible. But I'm not saying, I'm not a defender of, the end of trade, not at all. But I think we do have to have a different trade. We need, as much as possible, local production. And the food that we do ship, we really need to look at the supply chains. And that is actually a topic which most solidarity action, to actually come to your question, Farooq, have been a bit shying away from, because it's so complicated. Nobody understands food supply chains. And my argument is that this is on purpose. If you work, for example, with the big companies in Europe, which are importing stuff, they will tell you, not even our own procurement program would know where exactly the food comes from, which subcontractor sells it to what other subcontractor until it ends in our warehouse. So that's a designed program. And there's been quite a bunch of research on this. For example, a good article by Miriam Posner in Logic on exactly these supply chains and how they've been designed. And I think we need to politicize this. And there's a start.
Yes.
It's very fashionable now to talk about, for example, this book. It's a bestseller. People look at supply chains and say, okay, there has been some system introduced, building on containers, and these containers are sort of black boxes, and now we have to work within that system and cannot really change it. But what I want to say is that these black boxes, which are in the physical world, but also in the internet, they need to be broken up, and we need to look into these. And it's very difficult and annoying work. But I think that's what transnational solidarity would be useful for, in very, very concrete terms. What is happening in which country, and who suffers from these supply chains and from this very unsustainable way of producing food. So very, very long answer to saying it's not as easy as, having a few demonstrations here and there. We really need to get to the bottom of it, how the things are connected. And the issues might be very different in Europe and in Asia, but they are connected. And in both cases, they are a problem. So yeah, that's my answer to you, Farooq. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Felix. Now we are coming close to our webinar. I would just like to say that the present rulers everywhere want us to confine to our homes and say nothing. But we may stay at home because there is no vaccine available, but we will not be quiet. And we will not remain in the homes. We will come out today or tomorrow. We have to claim the right to demonstrate. We cannot really compromise on the freedom of association, freedom of getting together and protest and so on. And that time will come. And this time they seems to be little happy that there is not much resistance to them. But I can tell you, the small farmers, the landless peasantry, the agricultural workers, they are up to their neck, and they are talking about it, and they will speak themselves through their organizations and so on. Now, in the end, I would like to ask Ashlesha, who is also very active with the Lavia Compesina, and there is a UN Charter of Peasants, which was accepted by General Assembly of UN in December 2018. How relevant that UN Charter is to the present circumstances, because it talks about food sovereignty and it talks about land rights and it talks about the life at the village, a decent, honorable life in the village. So Ashlesha, can you comment on some of those issues?
Yeah, I can just briefly say because I have not been following this declaration very closely, Farooq, but I know it was a very landmark victory for the peasant movement globally, of course, and it took over 25 years of hard work. And that was not just at the UN level, but very much at the national levels by peasant movements working to get their own governments to, first of all, understand what this declaration is, why it's important and why they needed to support it. And I was thankful to see that most of our South Asian countries signed on to that. But now the real challenge, of course, is again bringing back that declaration back to our state representatives and bringing it back into the national conversation, discourse, and implementing it at the national level. And of course, some of the key things that that declaration really highlights is this rights and justice framework, which is quite missing in our conversations around the food system. When you look at the mainstream policy space, at least in India, it's only recently we have this very amazing policy on right to food, which was also the work of social movements who managed to force the government to have a right, which basically led to rations for particularly poorer people. So this kind of justice framework needs to come into farming, right to land. You know, many people have been speaking about land. And really, I personally see the work of social movements as being at the forefront. And without the work of social movement, we would not have this declaration, and we would not have so many other laws, and neither would we have their implementation. I think when somebody just spoke about land reform and redistribution of land, I also want to comment because I brought up this issue of women farmers. And really, oftentimes when we talk about land reform, women don't really fit into that picture. And in many, particularly in South Asia, we have a very patriarchal system where people don't understand why the woman should also have the land when it's part of the family ownership. And so this is something that we really must challenge, that land, it doesn't have to be just in the name of the woman, it can be joint, but women need to have land titles. And some social movements have engaged in many progressive efforts, particularly around collective approaches. And I see that as becoming more and more relevant now as a response to the individualization that is being forced upon us by neoliberalism. Collective approaches to land. Many women are getting together, forming small groups of 10, and they are leasing land. Many social movements are taking on these approaches. They are using that land for agroecology. And so these are the kind of sources of organizing and also responses, agroecological responses. And so I would just like to highlight that, that the importance of group approaches for responding to some of these crises that we're facing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ashlesha. Before we close up, I like to ask Yifang, who's my co-moderator, to sum up the whole discussion. And also, I would like to thank Farooq Suleria, translating into Urdu, and Sabine translating into Indonesian language, and above all, our Kathy, who was doing all the technical work, sending you messages and so on. So Yifang, if you can sum up in 2 minutes, and then we close the session today.
Okay, thank you very much, Farooq. Thank you very much. I'll probably not do justice summarizing what has already been said the last 1 hour and 30 minutes, but maybe just to probably end and conclude this session on a positive note, highlighting some issues that was already discussed or mentioned, but also mentioning something new. And first, I want to bring to our attention, maybe some of you already know, but the report was released yesterday by the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. So this report, titled Food Security and Nutrition, Building a Global Narrative Towards 2030, it calls for an urgent need for strengthening and I'm quoting, and consolidating conceptual thinking around food security nutrition to prioritize the right to food, which Ashlesha has already mentioned, and to widen our understanding of food security and to adopt the food systems analytical and policy framework. The same report also acknowledged agroecology initiatives as a good example of efforts to implement a radical transformation of the food systems as a whole. So I think this is really, this report really breaks new ground. And I think for the next session, we could then discuss some of these solutions that we have already or slowly touched upon today. But to also conclude, I think you mentioned Farooq, and it was also complemented by Ashlesha, the implementation of the UN Declaration for the Rights of Peasants. This is yet to be seen, the implementation, but I think it could really provide a powerful tool to demand for a just transition of our food system. So let's, continue reclaiming our rights. Yes, then I would like to conclude this webinar. It was not a summary as you have asked for, Farooq, but I hope it's okay. Yeah, we would like to conclude, and already said by Farooq, what we would like to do, there were many, many questions. We were not able to answer them all, but we will try to collect them and share our replies with everybody. And we will be more than happy if you would join us again in our next webinar, which is scheduled on the 10th of July at the same time.
Yeah, thank you, Yifang, and thank you all the participants who are listening to us for hour and a half, and also our resource person who did a great job. Thank you all. Hope to see you on 10th of July. But before that, please register for the webinar. Today, there was over 200 registration, and we are happy that you came in good numbers to register for our webinar. We hope to increase that number next time. Thank you and goodbye.